Now, let's transition to our first segment, where we'll delve into the historical context of queer grief. Understanding where we've been is crucial to understanding where we are now and where we hope to go. Grief in the LGBTQ+ community has deep roots, shaped by decades of struggle and resilience. To fully grasp the complexities of queer grief today, it's essential to look back at the historical context that has shaped our collective experience. Let's explore this history and see how it informs our present and future. In our first segment, we'll be delving into the historical context of queer grief and trauma. Understanding this context is essential to grasp the depth and nuances of the grief experienced by LGBTQ+ individuals and communities. Historically, LGBTQ+ people have faced severe oppression and violence, from being harassed and brutalized by police, jailed, or even sentenced to death for simply being who they are, to the more recent hate crimes and acts of violence, such as the murders of Islan Nettles, Carson, Jorge Stephen Lopez Mercado, Sakia Gunn, Muhlaysia Booker, Shepard, and many others. These incidents are not just isolated events, but are part of a long history of systemic oppression. One of the most significant periods of collective grief in the LGBTQ+ community was during the early years of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Hundreds of thousands of LGBTQ+ individuals lost their lives, exacerbated by the lack of governmental response and societal indifference. This period left deep scars and a lingering sense of loss that still impacts the community today. We also observe collective trauma, where an entire community is affected psychologically by acts of violence against its members. Even if they didn't directly experience the violence, members of the community might feel symptoms such as difficulty concentrating, loss of interest in activities, or feeling unsafe. The mass shootings at queer spaces like the Pulse Nightclub in Orlando and Club Q in Colorado Springs are stark reminders of this collective trauma. These tragedies reverberate throughout the community, bringing back the pain of past losses and fears for the future. It's important to note that collective trauma and historical trauma are interconnected. When a member of the community is attacked, it isn't just the immediate impact that hurts. It brings forth a flood of memories of past violence and oppression. Microaggressions, such as homophobic slurs, can trigger these deep-seated traumas, making everyday life a minefield of potential triggers. For transgender individuals, particularly Black trans women, the threat of violence is even more pronounced. The collective grief and trauma they experience are more intense due to the frequent and disproportionate targeting they face. This intersection of identities can amplify the feelings of fear and sadness, adding layers to their grief. As we consider these historical and collective traumas, it's crucial to normalize the experiences of those who are affected. Traditional trauma definitions often overlook the impact on those indirectly involved, but research has shown that the pain and fear experienced by the broader community are valid and significant. Ignoring or repressing these feelings can lead to unhealthy coping mechanisms, like substance abuse or toxic behaviors. One of the most challenging aspects of dealing with historical trauma is the ongoing nature. For marginalized communities, the trauma is not just a past event, but a continuous cycle, with new incidents reopening old wounds. This makes healing particularly difficult because the sources of trauma persist in the form of systemic oppression and recurring acts of violence. As we navigate this complex landscape, it's essential to validate the experiences of those dealing with historical and collective trauma. Listening, acknowledging their pain, and providing support are vital steps in their healing process. Every individual's reaction to trauma is unique, and their coping mechanisms will vary. Despite these challenges, the LGBTQ+ community continues to demonstrate resilience and find joy. They've learned to be vigilant, use their voices strategically, and support one another. This strength and solidarity within the community are powerful forces against ongoing oppression. Now, I'd like to open our floor to our panelists. How do you think historical and collective trauma have shaped the experiences of the queer community today? And what are some ways we can support individuals dealing with these deep-seated traumas?
Yeah, that's a lot to, to cover. I mean, you covered a lot of historical events that have shaped who we are in the queer community. You know, for me personally, growing up in the 90s, in the shadow of the 80s and the AIDS crisis was very difficult. Not only because of the fear of HIV, which was still very much present in the 90s, but just the whole, you have this understanding that we've lost an entire generation of people, and how hard that must have been. And would that be my story? Would that be what will encounter as I become more and more comfortable with who I am as a queer person? And those were questions that were always in my mind from middle school to high school, things that I had no control over, and nor was I well informed about because of the family situation that I grew up in. But it was just there. It was a constant little reminder of like what a possible future for me might look like.
I mean, I think about defining moments in my own life, and just hearing Matthew Shepard's name in the intro. I remember when his body was found. I remember it being a constant on the news. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't living in Wyoming. I was living in DC. I was an elementary school student. And I can remember the conversations with my grandparents just asking, wait, how did this happen? Why did it happen? Why are people so angry, right? And then seeing in 2008, the Hate Crimes Act passed in his name. And then recently, I think even a week ago, his mother, Judy Shepard, receives the National Medal of Freedom, right? And so it's this thing where I wonder, as we continue in a society that is not yet ready to live up to this idea of equality or justice or liberty for everyone, how many more Matthew Shepards we're going to see? How many more Judy Shepards are going to stand up for not just their children, but for all kids? And when are we going to decide that we've had enough?
Yeah.
I think that's a very valid point. I love, Dan, that you mentioned the ongoing aspect of this trauma. It's historical, it's ongoing. There's a lot that comes with that. There's a lot of emotional numbing that the queer community does as a way to deal with this, right? That's what leads to a lot of some negative coping mechanisms, some negative strategies. But I think it's also important to acknowledge the safety component that you're speaking about, right? If you're feeling unsafe, for whatever, financially unsafe, your environment is unsafe, you do not have the capacity to really process these traumas. So really for individuals in this community, it's so important to have a well-rounded type of support that can help them down the line, maybe begin to acknowledge a lot of what's happening for them.
Mm-hmm. I think also, for me, I think when you mentioned Pulse, I remember I was in high school when it happened, and I had a lot of friends who were openly out, and they told me they were just like, I can't believe it. Like, we only have like selected few places where we feel safe, that are just like places like either a comic book store or a nightclub, places that is just dedicated for the LGBTQ plus people, like youth and young adults, and the fact that they're being targeted. And so now it's like, even now, when I go out with my friends to these spaces, I'm like, I want to have fun, but I'm thinking in the back of my mind, like, what if somebody just decides that they just want to come in here and do something so horrible? And I agree with you, Kyle. Like, how many more like incidences there has to be until like collectively we all decide like, okay, this is enough. Like, we can't keep doing this. Like, we all acknowledge that it's bad, but we're not putting the pieces to actually make it a better place for everyone.
Yeah. And I can just say, kind of dovetailing off of what Tiffany was talking about, from a religious perspective, I think we're probably all aware of the role that religious communities have played in homophobia and transphobia, in creating a society, here in the United States and really now all over the world, where queer people are not welcomed in our spaces. And, you want to talk about compounding grief, especially historically. If you look at a religious community, it's like, what does a religious community provide? What does faith provide? It provides, access and connection to God, or whatever, deeper truth or universal spirit you may be praying to. It provides a sense of community and support for that. It also, for so many people, religion is a part of their family. And when you get cut out of that identity with your family, you see that there aren't those places of support for you. So I think as a pastor, and a queer pastor and a pastor of a church that is primarily queer, I think it is so important that we really stand up and be a loud voice of welcome for people, because I can't tell you the number of people who come into my office and say, I was hurt by the church and I'm just looking for a safe place to be. Mm-hmm. And, we want to be that. Dan, going back to the point you made earlier about queer resilience, I think that's another important thing too. It's like these faith communities tried to take our faith from us. They tried to take our spirituality from us. And there's a lot of queer people throughout history who said, no, you're not going to take it from me. My denomination, we ordained the first openly gay pastor back in 1972. Bill Johnson was his name, and he stood up and he said, I'm not going to let a church or a religion tell me that I don't have access to God and that I don't have a call to leadership. And a lot of queer people create their own religious traditions, and their own religious rituals and their own religious communities. And I think that's so important that, queer people stand up and say, our faith is important, our spirituality is important, and we're going to continue to access that and to create spaces for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that there's something to be said about the fact that the church did fail, or religious communities did fail the queer community, particularly during the 80s and during the AIDS crisis. I mean, I think about, this is something that's always in my head for some reason, that my own fear of having to die alone in a hospital bed without anybody there, without having my pastor, my priests, the people that were important to me, the things that connected me to something broader and larger than who I am, being denied that, and being denied my family, then being not, my friends couldn't come and see me because nobody knew what was happening. No one knew how it was spread, especially in the early times of the AIDS crisis. And I wonder if, for us to have some collective healing, is that something that maybe we should look at again, or reopen that in a way that there's healing for it? That the church can do something that, I don't know, that says we're sorry, but also like here is the space that we should have given, your friends, your families, your those that were suffering, because that was a very dark time for the gay community and for a lot of people, because if it wasn't just queer people that were being affected, it's their friends, their family members, people that were important to them. So I don't know. I'm happy that the church has come a long way, and I'm happy that we have, we're getting to this point, and society has come a long way as well. But there's still so much to be spoken about, particularly when grief is something that we don't talk about, period. Not just in the queer community, but in other spaces. And I think that queer resilience is something, like you said, Erin, that we do create on our own because we have to. We're forced to create that resilience. We're forced to be there for one another. And I'm grateful that we do that, but I also think that there's so much more healing that needs to be done.
I love that, Harold. I think that you're touching on such a larger topic of trust in the queer community. How can you trust a particular space, whether it's a church space, where there is a medical center? How can you come in and trust when so many people that were supposed to be there for you have let you down, right? There's a lot of grief in that in itself. And when you talk a lot about the resilience. I love resilience, and similar to you, as you were saying, it also just, to me, it means like you're continuing to fight through all of these things, and you haven't taken a time to really sit with it, because you cannot. You have to continue to move forward with it, and it's so devastating for people to go through that. But I think trust is so crucial. So how do we build that trust? You know, in our organization, at CBC, we really try to build that trust by bringing in folks from the queer community, by connecting with other community organizations that are very present and very trusting of that organization. So I think that continued work, we all need to stay connected. It's so cliche. It takes a village, but it really does.
Yeah.
There's even like now, I think the last school I went to go visit was in a not so great neighborhood. And I mean, they were just surprised that somebody came out to like go see them and talk to them. And interesting enough, our conversation went around, I was like, oh, what's something you want to talk about? And they were like, oh, church. And I was like, okay, like what do you want to talk about? And a lot of their concerns are the same thing. They're like, you know, they are religious, but they feel like they have to choose between being LGBTQ plus or being faithful, you know, and they just kind of wish that their parents weren't so rigid to like one side of that meter. So they're also afraid of like telling their parents like, yeah, I'm actually gay. And they're going to be like, oh, no, you're not, you know? And I think another thing that they had mentioned to me, they basically just wish that their own pastors could just be like, that's okay. And like, we welcome you. And like, you're not like a pariah, like you're not shunned. And it's really difficult for them. And they just really have a hard time. And especially like they all mentioned, they're like, we know we don't live in the best neighborhood. And, you know, our churches are a lot more like old school. I'm like, I know, but it usually takes one person to kind of start making that change. And of course, they're all like high schoolers. So they're kind of like, I mean, you're saying all the right things, but I don't want to be that person to, you know? And I'm like, you know, it just made me realize, I was like, maybe there's something I know not every teenager is like religious, but for those who are like faithful and they're looking for those spaces, I feel like, you know, trying to see how do we connect these kids together? How do we kind of heal them? Because a lot of them feel ashamed for being who they are. And they just want to be able to be both and not have to choose.
Yeah, if I can go back to something, Julissa, that you said, that when you talk about, you know, those like communities of support, you know, in pastoral care, we always talk about, you know, how do we get people to sit with their grief, to be in touch with their grief and get over the fear basically that prevents them from doing that. And a lot of times the fear is like, I'm going to get into my grief and there's going to be nothing there to support me when I'm there. And when you're told that God isn't going to be there to support you and you don't have a community there to support you, yeah, people are not able to access that. So I agree. I really think that faith communities, the queer community in general, how do we come together and create spaces where people can be held, where they can access their grief, and where they can be healed through that process? Yeah, that's kind of a challenge for us as a wider community, I think.